Welcome to a new podcast by wrestling fans for wrestling fans. We are Wrestling with Memories, the news podcast co-hosted by myself, Fash, the $1 million fan, the wrestling specialist, Poddy Piper. You could call me any of these things. And I'm joined by my co-host, the man, the one and the only Wax, the brain Hussein. Wax and Fash probably sound similar to something in the past, but ultimately we're on a nostalgia trip here. We are two wrestling fans from back in the day. We fell in love with the business in the early 90s, like many people in the United Kingdom did as little kids. And we then stuck with it, even through the bad periods of 93 to 95, when a lot of people walked away from the wrestling business. We didn't. We stuck with it and then were rewarded, starting in 1996 with Nitro and Raw going head to head, the NWO coming into play, and ultimately the Attitude Era, which gave us another boom with everyone suddenly becoming wrestling fans again. We got some of the biggest stars ever. And ultimately, the aim of this podcast is to cover the nostalgia years. It's us taking you through from around about 1991 all the way to 2002, the glory years. So up to the 10-year period of when we got the closure of WCW and WWF ultimately won, to the year after in terms of what was the aftermath. But we're not really going to just be focusing on these periods. We can deviate from that. We'll consider topics before and after, because ultimately, like yourselves, we are wrestling fans of all years and have stuck with it through the good times and the bad. And with that, I'm going to throw it off to my co-host Wax. What's happening, man? What's on your mind?
All good, Fash. I can't believe it. We're finally here. We've been talking about this moment for.
Look at that! I've got my rock mug as well, just to
As we've got,
bring
we've
nostalgia
already
into
got the
things.
memorabilia in the show already. We've finally done or starting our podcast. We've been talking about it for so long, a number of months. We've done a lot of testing in the background to make sure everything has been ready and set, and we're finally ready to kick off. And as you say, we both have a really interesting journey in terms of wrestling fandomship. Probably starting off roughly at the very same time. Um, our fathers were in business together, or have been in business together for a very long time. Through that, we've got to know each other. And to be honest, I can't remember a time when there wasn't a Farakash or a Fash and or wrestling at the same time. So that's my earliest memory, really, of wrestling is
Yeah,
with
I
yourself.
think we're talking early '91, right? Maybe tail end of 1990. So what I would have been 7 or 8, and you would have been five,
Yeah.
5 or 6 at that time. So yeah, ultimately, as you say, it was the big thing in the playground. As everybody who's going to be listening to this from this similar vintage to us, it was a new thing. I think Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles were the thing prior to it, and people were going off that, and suddenly professional wrestling was the talk of the playground. Um, and I think, as you say, everyone was quite intrigued by it. And it helped if you had Sky Sports in the UK, which you did. Ultimately, I only heard about it. And I remember coming to your home and to others that had access to kind of understand what was this? Who's Hulk Hogan? Who's the Ultimate Warrior? And from there, as you say, we just kind of fell in love with it. I think the first memory I have is people trading cards in the playground, and then buying some of these and not really knowing who the guys were, but wanting to find out more. um, and I think yours will be similar in terms of
Yeah, well,
other people
actually, I think
too.
if I think back, it was my older cousins that used to watch or used to come over,
That's right, that's right.
find the VCR to hit record, and then they'd go away and collect the tape. And I would be really interested, what is it that they're recording and watching? So before they could come and collect the tape, I'd watch it. I got hooked very quickly to wrestling. I don't know, it's just one of those things back in the early 90s that was just bigger than life,
It was
larger
the
than life. That's what
characters,
they say.
wasn't it? The larger than life. And I think we'll obviously at times speak about the state of the business today, but I think that's what drew everyone. The hook was the larger than life characters, um, that basically the superheroes basically on live
I think what
television.
what cemented it for me is we our grocery store that our father used to own together. They had a video shop as part of that, and within that video shop there were maybe a handful, 5 or 6 videos of wrestling, WWF, that they used to have.
Yeah,
I think mostly it was late 80s stuff. From what I can remember,
I
the
can
Survivor
still
Series,
remember.
the
I can
Coliseum
still remember
videos,
Stash.
the tune that used to play on that video. I still remember it, and those videos we watched over and over and over again, and I think that's why I remember those late '80s pay-per-views so well, even though I didn't watch them live.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's in line with my. I mean, I remember I was in my house and my elder cousin came and he just asked me, "Okay, what are you into these days?" And I said, "Oh, I'm into wrestling." And my dad said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, we've got wrestling videos. I'll bring some." So I remember the first two he brought were something called Greatest Hits. It was a Coliseum
Yeah,
video, and I think it was Hulk Hogan and Tugboat versus Dino Bravo and Earthquake in that video. So it was a whole collection of kind of house show matches and things. And then the other one, if you remember this, and I think a lot of our listeners will remember this one, it was the double tape for WrestleMania 4.
yeah,
Remember, it was a 4 hour event and it was two cassettes. And the third being Survivor Series 1988. So I
yeah.
remember those being the three that he brought initially. And at the same time, obviously, and you were watching some of the stuff that was going on. So we're talking, say, 91, the summer, things were picking up. Um, and I remember all of us really getting hooked into the whole Jake the Snake, Randy Savage feud.
And we'll talk about
And
that in a lot of
we'll
detail,
talk about
hopefully.
it in more detail, but I remember that being one of the key memories and lots of other changes happening in 91. But yeah, it was all that stuff. And you said you started watching the tapes and you didn't care what vintage it was. You didn't watch them in any order because you didn't know. But it was, you had to be in on this. And
And
then, obviously,
everything was so real. It was so important. Like
well, that's the thing because
everything.
we were marked. So you're little
Yeah,
kids. It's real. I mean, you don't learn until many years later that it's predetermined. But at that point, you didn't care, and it was I said everyone was in it, and
definitely.
everyone
And I
was
think
into it.
over the years after that, every time we'd see each other, we were putting on our own wrestling events, our own main event wrestling matches, in all various settings, in the backyard, in the living room, you know,
It was
um,
anywhere there was a space. I remember it was
anywhere.
you guys because you're five brothers, right? So it was
Yeah,
you had the spare room. There was
yeah.
the gardens. I say the backyard. We did a lot of that and any opportunity. And then it was like even the
It's
neighbors, right? Remember,
yeah,
you tried to gather as many kids as you could to
yeah.
do an event and a
And we
Royal
used to
Rumble
have
and a
we used to
thing.
have a small room with a big, large double bed and a single bed joined together, and that was our Royal Rumble arena. Um, we had like seven
And
or
then
eight
there was
kids.
and then there was the wrestling figures, remember? So we're talking £5 a pop here, which nowadays sounds like nothing, but I remember in more testing times it seems quite an expensive purchase if you went for more than a couple. So I remember buying the first two I bought were Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man. I remember grabbing about 10 figures and my dad telling me to calm down and say, look, take two right now and go from there. So it was like whoever had wrestling figures, you kind of swapped. You brought them to each other's houses. So
I mean, that was
everything
the
was
that was the
basically
highlight of me.
wrestling fit.
Yeah, it was one of the highlights of me coming over to your house, pulling out those wrestling figures and a Yellow Pages, which is a big book because we never had a ring. It used to have a big black plastic hat. I don't know what that was for, but it used to have all the figures in it.
You saw all the figures in
Uh,
it, yeah.
we used to have a dice. Used to
Well,
play
this is
that,
it. Talk
play
about
our
the
own.
dice because this is something that if people played with wrestling figures, I don't think most would have played with them dice. And this was another family friend who was a couple of years older than me who taught me this
Yep.
technique of playing with the wrestling figures where you had a dice which gave it an element of unpredictability. So maybe you want to explain that
Yeah,
to
so obviously we'd have our
listeners.
own little wrestler. We'd combine them two. We'd have our own little setup, do our little match, and obviously we needed a result somehow. So in essence, we would roll a one if we were putting the opponent in a submission maneuver.
That's what you'd want, yeah.
If you rolled a three and you had them in a pin maneuver, then you would win. And also you could also go for the count out, which was the
The
odd
six.
option, but the what you had to roll to win a match by count out.
Yeah, so it was
And it had to align with obviously what you were doing in the ring. Um, and
it
again,
was
we had
which gave
tons of
it,
fun.
like I said, which gave it the unpredictability, right? So you didn't know who was going to win. So it was interesting. But yeah, that was something that another old school wrestling fan taught me back in 91, 92. And I think we did that for a while.
Yeah,
But
and
that's the thing, isn't it? There's so many, once you start recollecting, there are so many memories and things that I'm sure we've forgotten, we'll remember. And I guess our listeners will remind us because I expect across the world, right, the journeys will be similar because one thing, as you said, we had this kind of family bond and there was the whole thing about that and then wrestling strengthened it in many respects. But actually we've made so many other friends across the world who essentially is because they're wrestling fans and over here you have that in common and you all go in your separate kind of routes. but that's the one common thread that you still talk about the past, and you're still watching the events today. So it's quite. I remember when somebody once said to me that it's a bit of a community in terms of when you follow sports or wrestling or something similar, you end up kind of being part of this. Um, I wouldn't say the online wrestling community or the or the IWC, which gets a lot of bad press and mixed vibes. But yeah, I mean, most people that are from our era are still watching it, following the business because yeah, this is every aspect of it that was intriguing.
It's because we grew up with it, and it was our, it was our childhood. I'm sure lots of people have different childhoods. So PlayStations, or well, not PlayStation because back then there was none. But all
Sega
the
Mega
gaming,
Drive
yeah,
too,
Sega Mega Drive.
Nintendo.
We never really had that. And for us, our passion has always been wrestling from a young age.
But the key thing was you used to record all the events from here, right? So I guess, as I said, I didn't get Sky to the year 2000. So all of the years, which were the kind of vintage years, start off with you and your cousins, as you say, recording the events. And I remember it being Survivor Series 91, uh, WrestleMania, Royal Rumble 92, everything, in 93 Royal Rumble. I remember you recorded that and sent it to me the next day. So you had this anticipation of receiving these videos, but it was for a number of years. And then I tried to use my net, and then it was neighbors which lived in the same street would record me stuff, other friends, and everyone was so kind to me in terms of doing that and kind of facilitating my habit until, and then school, when we got to high school, and at that point it was another group of wrestling fans, and everyone kind of, this was the thing about going back to the community, right? If somebody had a tape or anything, they would trade, and the tape trading was a big thing. But the live events, if somebody had Sky, that person would record it, watch it, and then distribute it as well. So it was great in that sense,
Yeah, and
because everybody wanted to watch it, right? But they also wanted the opinion of others. Did you enjoy it? And the chat after was just as important as watching, if not more, because you didn't have the internet then. You didn't have chat sites. You didn't have people straight away posting on Twitter and saying, "Oh, this is good. This was terrible." And as you say, there was more innocence because you didn't understand the workings of it. So it was more just about, did you see X, and then you'd have that playground
Mhm.
discussion on it.
Well, I mean, one source of knowledge that we both used at different times was the wrestling hotlines.
Got in a bit of trouble for that.
Yeah, we did. So I remember before actually the wrestling hotline itself, there was another one, like a wrestling quiz. Um, that I don't know how I found it, but in essence, you would call the number. They would ask you, 5 or 6 questions, and might win a prize at the end. But it would always be the same questions, and I might not get them all right in the first go, but I think I've made 10, 11 goes in the same day. And it was only a little bit later on down the line when my dad got the phone bill. Woke me up one morning before school, sat me down on the couch, and showed me this listing of phone numbers with extortionate amounts of money next to them, and asked, "What are these?" And it took me a few minutes to realize, oh shit, this is those wrestling hotlines that I've
Oh,
been
you thought,
calling.
yeah, you didn't
Uh,
link the scam with it.
no, but anyway, I spent hours on those things, and then later on, the proper wrestling hotlines where we would call to get information about what's happened that week,
Well,
write
yeah,
it
well,
down, and then we would.
Guys in the UK will remember Power Slam magazine,
Yep.
and that was something we used later on. So we're talking mid to late 90s, but that was the hotline that we used to sometimes call. I remember 96 to 99, there were periods, and I would once again, my dad would also look at the, what are you doing? And I'd say, I won't do it again. So this is a bit of a, but then we kind of, went on the straight and narrow and stopped doing that and just getting the magazines. But even with the magazines, it started off with the typical WWF magazine, right? And then it would be WCW magazine was available. So sometimes you'd grab that because that wasn't really available in the UK. I know ITV showed some WCW, but we were still kind of distant from it. And then later on, it was your kind of Pro Wrestling Illustrated and Power Slam was something that we used, but that was later on. Initially, it was very much what the kind of mark wrestling fans would use, which was the typical WWF magazine. And it was obviously a lag of a few months when these things came out, but you loved it still and you collected it. And it was a key thing. But one thing I want to point out here is I was recalling some of the memories, and one thing you always did from the beginning was you always rooted for the bad guys, for the heels. So I remember initially you were a big Jake the Snake Roberts fan when he was a bad guy. Then Ric Flair entered the company, and you said, "Oh, I'm Ric Flair," because when you used to have this backyard wrestling, these matches, you'd always be the bad guy. And then after that, a guy who will probably talk about as we cover the year 1993. Ludwig Borga was a big one that you liked as well. So what was the thing of being drawn
Actually,
to the bad guys? Because that was odd at that time, because I was the Ultimate Warrior, or
yeah.
later on, you're somebody along those lines. But you always went for the heels right at the beginning. And we're talking about, you being very young at the time.
It's funny actually. You mentioned that because I hadn't thought about it, and oh, now you mention it, it does.
Yeah.
It's clear to me that that's how it used to be. But I don't know. I just found them really cool. Those bad guys. Maybe not Ludwig Borga, right? But the Ric Flair and Jake Snake. I mean,
No, we used to do the Ludwig Borga thing. Remember, he used to do that cheek thing where he puff a bit of air. I remember he used
yeah.
to copy that.
Well, I think
Ric Flair is
they
Ric Flair, right? Everybody's
yeah.
gonna love Ric Flair, but and Jake Roberts was like at his best
Uh,
in that 91, 92 period. But it was still
I
interesting
think
that
they were
I'd
just
always
so
wanted to be the
believable.
heel.
I think that they were just so believable that th- it made them cool and interesting, and that's why I love them. And it's funny that now, after us listening to all the different podcasts and having internet available to us, we're now well versed in all of wrestling. But
Yeah,
back then in the early '90s, it was solely WWF.
yeah.
Everything
Ultimately, that's what
WWF
that was
was,
wrestling. Yeah,
and it when I eventually realized Ric Flair actually didn't come from WWF, he was brought in from WCW for a while. I was like shocked. I was like, this is like breaking, my
yeah,
mind.
exactly.
I
Well,
thought he
that's the
was
thing.
always WWF, and same with lots of guys, which now you know better, and you appreciate the business a lot more
Yeah,
for.
because the only reason I knew he was right because a few guys had WCW figures and they were those plasticky ones, and they had Sting, Lex Luger, and Ric Flair. So I'd heard of Ric Flair, but once again, hadn't watched WCW. And then obviously the way he debuted, which we'll obviously address as well in due course with the big gold belt. That was obviously at young age even intriguing. This guy saying he's the real world champion. What's the story behind this? Um, but yeah, I mean, it was all filtered, right? You didn't really know. Um, and then obviously there was various other things. There'd be changes in the rosters and various other things going on that which you didn't know at the time. And that's why I think with all of us wrestling fans, as we got older and we started digging into the business and understanding it, there was so many. I mean, behind the scenes was way more interesting at times what was happening, on screen. And certainly, I mean, obviously we're looking to cover. I said 1991 to 2002 primarily because we feel that was the kind of big boom, the trough, then it exploded again, and we were at different stages of our kind of lives as well, which made it really interesting. And those are the periods even now, right? You go online, people talk about the Attitude Era, they talk about the Monday Night Wars. How many podcasts have been rehashed reviewing that stuff or talking about it? But the fact is, it was the most
Most
exciting
popular
period,
part
the
of
most
wrestling
popular, the
that we
most
remember.
mainstream.
Yeah,
And that's why we're on that trip as well. And I mean, we always talk about it. So obviously, when the idea came, well, why not do a podcast? And hopefully, other fans join us. And in due course, we'll speak to other fans as well. But the key is to relive those memories. But obviously, when we initially looked at a lot of the stuff, it was with the lens of being those kids and not knowing the other stuff. And now you're looking at it with a different lens, maybe a more critical lens, if you're me. And discussing the key elements of everything,
yeah,
and what was, and the idea is obviously year by year we'll look at things, so we'll focus on specific events, but in general, starting off with the start of a year and going through all the key developments, and then zeroing in on certain events and happenings as well, but the key thing being from our perspective, discussing the characters, the storylines, the things that we still remember, but the things maybe we don't recall as much or fans have forgotten. Um, and yeah, there's so much to talk about, that yeah, it should be interesting.
definitely, definitely. I mean, and we chose this period because I think it resonates most with us. And
And I think in
this week,
general, I would argue with most fans because, like I said, once again, people our age will always talk about with the initial boom of Hogan, Savage, Warrior, everybody knew them. Then you had the new generation phase, which, like I said, the fans that really stuck with it, and British fans for sure, a lot of us stuck with it. And it was the kind of quiet periods, but you had Brett and Sean and Diesel and Razor, and The Undertaker was there the whole time. And then ultimately, we move into 96, 97, and then there was big changes happening. So I think one, yeah, as you say, it's the most kind of exciting period for us because we kind of grew with it. But even since then, I mean, like I said, we're following the business like many others are. But that was probably the period that everyone still calls back to when you're
yep,
talking with the biggest names. And I said not that we're not going to cover periods post that, because there's lots of interesting things and events that happen after up till now, and even before, as you said, because there's probably not an event that we've ever missed.
Yep.
But that's the core kind of 10-11 year period we want to cover, because that's when you had WWF, you had WCW, you had ECW later on, and lots of maneuverings between them all. And then ultimately 2001 was a watershed moment, and you could argue to this day if it was a good thing or a bad thing, with competition coming to an end. And now today we're seeing it re-emerge a little bit again with AEW. But yeah, certainly that was an amazing period for professional wrestling, and the story of it all is that's why you've got so many shows similar to us. Obviously we'll put our own spin to it, but so many podcasts as well. It's just the golden era.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We may not watch it as closely as we did before, but we still relive all those old events and times and storylines that from the '90s all the way through to the mid 2000s.
And that's the
So
thing. I mean, like I said, there's some fans younger than us that will hopefully in due course speak to. But yeah, the key thing is that, like you said, nowadays I think a lot of fans will check online to see what happened on Raw or SmackDown or Dynamite, and then they'll look and they'll decide, well, I'll give it a miss, or I'll watch a segment or two, and maybe they focus on the events and they don't even watch all the events. But before this period, um, you couldn't miss anything, and even if you could watch 5-10 minutes, you'd do it. Superstars, Wrestling Challenge, Primetime Wrestling, then
it's
transitioning into Raw. And
sometimes even foreign wrestling, wrestling that we
well,
never.
you used to watch it because you had DSF, right? Which people, once
Yeah,
again, who had
exactly. So
Sky will remember. It was WCW
uh,
dubbed in German, wasn't it?
it was it was all sorts. It was WCW. It was in German. There was lots of Japanese wrestling, and I'd watch it hours on end, just watching all this different types of wrestling, not understanding a word of what was being said, but just enjoying watching all these crazy matches from different places. But yeah, it's going to be a great journey. I think hopefully we'll bring you lots of information that you maybe didn't know, or just stuff that you want to relive with us. And for me, certainly, I'll be reliving it for the first time for most of these things. But I do remember everything, like it was yesterday, especially those early
Yeah.
'90s. So, Fash, what do we have coming up in the first episode?
Well, I think we're going to start off with 1991, which was the year that you particularly enjoyed. And for me, it kind of picked up in the second half of the
Yep,
year. Not so much in the first half, but that was essentially infancy of us being fans. So even though, we weren't following it completely, this is when we really got connected to the Ultimate Warrior, to Hulk Hogan, to Randy Savage, etc. So I think we'll start off with an overview of 1991, and no better place to start than the Royal Rumble and what led up to it. But I think there was a lot of interesting things that were happening in 1990 as well that
yeah.
led into the year. So I think that's I think we should start off with and kick off the journey. But the one that I'm looking more forward to is 1992, because I think that was the
Yeah,
real
so I think we won't
interesting.
spend too much time on '91 just because, as you
Yeah,
say, it was probably the second half of the year building up into Royal Rumble.
yeah,
That is that is when we really started watching, and hopefully we'll spend
yeah.
a
And
lot
I
of
think
time.
92 was just such a big year in terms of things that happened, roster shifts, behind the scenes stuff, and what happened in 92 then essentially led to the changes in the
Yep.
situation in 93, 94, and 95. So I'm certainly looking forward to that. But as you say, we'll have a initial episode in 91. And yeah, just keep, building in our thoughts, opinions, and reliving that era of professional wrestling, and hopefully taking our listeners with us on the road, and they can also give their opinions and share their memories with us, because ultimately this is wrestling with memories, and it's not just about us. This is two wrestling fans going through the nostalgia trip, but we want as many of you to join us as possible.
Yep. Can't wait to get started, Fash.
Okay, Wax, we will touch base again then shortly. Viewers and listeners, this is Wrestling with Memories, and we'll catch you on the other side.